so that the option, let's put it this way, if there wasn't razor wire placed out and the police had in essence still lined up from the north coming down to the south to try to disperse to the side, you would simply find that the protesters would have probably gone in both directions, east and west. So that was used as the name depicts, a canalizing measure, that once the dispersion had started, that they saw, because of the natural barrier, or the police-made barrier now, that the only option was to move off to the open fields. That was what I was hoping was going to happen and anticipated to happen with the razor wire placed out.
But Colonel Scott, in the period of time where just the razor wire is deployed, you've just testified that the protesters are still, if they're moving off the Kopi, they could well still try to come around to the east. The presence of the razor wire at that stage of the plan would not canalize them to the west.
No, the canalizing is part of the dispersion. The phase one, which is the drawing out of the razor wire, was simply to enhance that canalizing, but also now to put up a protective barrier so that the violent actions may not come against the police, and in essence again not have to have the police retaliate against the protesters because of a natural barrier between them. A razor wire barrier, not a natural barrier.
Colonel, how much time did you estimate it would take for the units to move to the north in your planning? What did you estimate?
That would happen quite rapidly, Commissioner. Once the razor wire was out and the vehicles were confirmed in position, it was a matter of immediately go out. There wasn't supposed to be some long period of wait. It was a flowing operation. So when you call in phase one is completed, it's immediately, okay, initiate phase two. And that's when the vehicles would have driven around. So it's almost close to immediate.
But Colonel Scott, I'm correct that you anticipate the original plan was that the razor wire would be deployed, then a warning would be given to the crowd to disperse, and only once some time had been given for people to leave would a dispersal plan be put into place. So it's not immediately upon deployment of the razor wire. There would have been a period of time after the warning for people to leave before further steps would be taken to disperse them.
Yeah, the warning, as I stated, that was left to the operational commander at his discretion. So I can't go into when he would have taken that, but I would have done that after forming up, making sure that we were placed and ready, and then I would have given the warnings and given the intentions of what we wanted to do. Obviously then given the time periods and as it flows in the dispersion. So initially there will be two warnings. It was left to Brigadier Carlos to decide when he was going to, and I think maybe he'll testify as to when he was going to. And I was cautious not to dictate to the public order commanders, because I knew that this is what they do, this is their speciality, and I didn't want to tell him what to do in that essence. But as I say, how I'd envisioned it was to go out, form up, warn them, wait 15 to 20 minutes, re-warn them again that the action's about to commence, and then commence.
Right. Colonel Scott, could I ask you to turn to page 110 of Mr. White's final statement, and paragraph 7.5.6 in particular. This is where Mr. White says that the choreography of the implementation of stage 3 of the plan was shambolic. And he's dealing with the fact that the barbed wire was rolled out consecutively rather than simultaneously, and that it took 9 minutes and 30 seconds for the barbed wire to be rolled out. And then he says, in my experience of crowd behavior, an action by police provokes a reaction by the crowd. It's entirely unsurprising that the crowd moved off the Kopi during these 9.5 minutes, but it appears that SAPS did not anticipate their move. Do you agree with that statement by Mr. White?
Well, I planned it to happen simultaneously, so, and this is why I think when the chairperson asked earlier in the commission, the anticipation now that they were going to approach the police line, I hadn't done, because I expected the razor wire to be rolled out simultaneously, not giving the protesters that much time to come towards the police. And in essence, part of the contingency plan for that was to have had the public order line that was stationary as the monitoring line in support of those rolling out the razor wire, as well as backup TRT teams in case it got to the place where it became violent to life-saving circumstances. So those contingencies were built in there, but in my ideal of the operation, it was going to happen simultaneously and happen quickly, and then obviously the move out. But you're right in saying that if they had taken the option to disperse on the verbal warning of disperse, my point of view was they were to be left, and I think the commanders understood that too. They were to be left. Then it would have simply been not us having to create a volatile situation or raise emotions which would have conflicted in the townships or had the fruits they have shown there, but they would have then given us the opportunity to go over to the cordon and search operations later that night at the hostels. But the fact was that the police then were showing that we now need to end this. So it was never one of those that we were going to force the situation into ripeness, if I could put it that way. If they dispersed on verbal, then they dispersed on verbal. That was how I envisioned it happening.
Okay. Colonel Scott, to go back to the start of my question, do you accept Mr. White's premise that an action by police provokes a reaction by the crowd?
I do, and again, it's taking it into the classic crowd control situation. So crowds differ, as we know, but again, the defensive measure which was done here was something that in our standard operating procedures doesn't need to be communicated. For the very reason that you don't want them to understand that you're about to either isolate a key point, draw a barrier between you and them for a very strategic reason. And if it did invite response, the responsible citizen should have had the response of moving away, not moving toward, which...
You didn't have any belief that you had a congregation of responsible citizens in front of you, did you?
No, but I didn't anticipate necessarily... the anticipation was there, but it wasn't high on my scale of probability, if I can put it that way, that they were going to come to the razor wire. I did anticipate that it could happen at points. Thus, the contingency plans for those Nyalas and their members.
But to be fair to you, there were two things that you hadn't planned for which you can't be held responsible. The one was that the barbed wire was uncoiled sequentially and not simultaneously. And you realised that if it was done sequentially, you dealt with Mr. Shaskerson, there would be problems that you were intending to prevent by having it done simultaneously.
Yes.
And the second thing is you didn't know that the Nyala 6 had been moved.
I was aware. I saw a photograph of that chairperson. I didn't take the decision, but I was aware that it had been moved because I'd seen a photograph of the deployment on ground.
This before
the 1330 JOCOM.
Before 1330. But did you apply your mind to the possible consequences of that move?
I didn't expect the crowd as such, as a group, to stand up and move in the direction it did. I did anticipate that possibly happening once the physical dispersion occurred, that there may be a closing of the ground on the POP members, but I never anticipated that happening at that time of the operation.
Chair, if we could go back to page 84 of Mr. White's statement in the display, which is the picture of phase 1 of stage 3 of the plan. So, Colonel Scott, do you agree that the razor wire, as it rolled out in the way that it rolled out, channeled the protesters towards Nkaneng and towards around the kraal, rather than that they should move to the west? That the act of where the razor wire was deployed could still have served to channel them towards Nkaneng rather than force them to move west?
But, Mr. Leroux, hasn't the witness repeatedly said that channelizing was part of the dispersal action? But is that question fair in the light of that answer?
Commissioner Hemmerich,
See, there's a distinction, I think, between channeling as a transitive verb, if you know what I mean, and channeling in the passive sense, being channeled, not because it was intended that should happen, but it was a result of what had happened. And the question as phrased, I think, is ambiguous. Perhaps you could, and he's made it quite clear that he never intended to channel them or canalize, whatever the correct word is, towards Nkaneng, on the contrary. But and the question you ask seems to ignore that point that he's made. So perhaps you could rephrase it in a way that's fair.
Perhaps the appropriate question would be that it left an approach towards Nkaneng wide open, or something to that effect.
Chair and Commissioner Hemraj, the point I'm trying to get comment on from Colonel Scott is I hear him saying that it was an unintended consequence, that it would channel protesters toward Nkaneng.
Either of us has a problem with what you want to put to him. Is our difficulty is the way it's been phrased, which raises difficulties which I don't think you even want to encounter. So perhaps you can rephrase the question in a way which addresses the points put to you, then we can carry on.
Colonel Scott, do you agree with me that the unintended consequence of the deployment of razor wire was to channel people towards Nkaneng?
I'm afraid I still have a difficulty with that question in the light of his previous answers. I think you need to rephrase it. I'm going to say something, Mr. Semenya.
Exactly.
Mr. Semenya, please proceed.
No, I was just going to raise the same point, Chair. We see what we see. I don't know what the opinion of this witness will even add to what we see.
Chair, I'm not sure I understand the difficulty, because as I understand where we are, the proposition put by Mr. White is that the deployment of the razor wire in fact channeled people towards Nkaneng. If they were leaving the Kopi, they were likely to return home. The razor wire would then channel them to that path to Nkaneng. The fact that it may have been an unintended consequence of Colonel Scott's plan then begs the next question, which you, Chair, have already put, which is, did you anticipate this consequence? And the answer was he didn't. So Mr. White's point is not that it was an unintended consequence, but that the very result of the way the razor wire was deployed, once Nyala 6 had been moved back, was to channel people towards Nkaneng. If they saw the police roll out barbed wire and they wanted to get home, it would channel them into that area around the kraal.
Mr. Semenya?
Sure, obviously with the appreciation that these witnesses like Mr. White have not testified, and even the conclusions they draw have not been challenged, I think we should do this with a little bit of caution, with respect. And particularly, I don't see where Mr. White is saying the razor wire was channeling them towards Nkaneng.
Chair, perhaps we can frame this in terms of Mr. White's own statement. So, page 84, at the bottom of the page, he says, because the POP, TRT, NIU and STF are not yet deployed to the north of the Kopi, the L shape of the razor wire invites or channels protesters to move towards the informal settlement until such time as the members move into position to the northwest of the kraal. So I'm asking Colonel Scott whether in his plan, when Nyala 6 is moved back and the shape of the razor wire changes and the members are not deployed, does he accept Mr. White's conclusion that it in fact channeled people?
Well, you see, the problem is he uses the word channels in quotation marks. So he's not using it in its ordinary sense. And that I think gives rise to some of the difficulty. Perhaps we could try with invite. You see what Mr. White says, that he says because the POP, TRT, NIU and STF hadn't yet been deployed to the north of the Kopi, the L shape of the wire invited, as he suggests in quotation marks, the protesters, whom I would prefer to call the strikers, to move towards the informal settlement until such time as the members moved into position to the northwest of the kraal, which would of course prevented them from going there. That's his point. The question is, do you agree with it or don't you? And if you don't agree, the next question will be, why don't you?
Chairperson, and maybe it's me playing devil's advocate again, but we know what we know now, and we see what we see from aerial photography. The perception that existed in the strikers' minds at that time is maybe what's at question, because Nyala 5, where it was positioned, could still have driven straight. We know that Nyala 6 was moved because it had the militant group moved to it, and it was thus brought back to safety. So, in essence, for the strikers to have known that the police were now planning to isolate themselves, in essence, I'm not sure whether that was known, specifically sitting at ground level and seeing the line in front of you, with Nyala 6, which was obviously approached and was moved away. So that's just one question. And the second question, again, moving off in a so-called militant group like we see, even in the recent footage which has come to light, when that group turns to face the police, they take up the same stance, and before they even leave, they're leaving with the same militant stance of tapping weapons together, etc., as was experienced on Monday. So the question is, if it was merely a matter of going home or wanting to disperse on their own, why the same action as was displayed, which was militant towards the police and then to approach the police in the same manner? So these are questions on the opposite side of the coin which also still need to then be put forward.
That raises a question which I've been puzzling about for a long time, and I hope that by the end of the commission we may have found the answer, is were the militant group advancing towards the police because they were on their way to Nkaleng, or were they advancing to the police because they wanted to attack them and drive them away so they could be left undisturbed? There were threats that were made by them before that. Whether those were just empty threats or were they intended to be implemented, we don't know. There's a suggestion that they may have thought they were invincible and invulnerable, which might also have strengthened that inference, but it's a question to which I don't know the answer, and you obviously don't know the answer either. But the present question presupposes that they were moving towards Nkaleng to get there, and not that they were moving towards the police to attack them. But having made that point, the question still is there, whether, assuming they were moving towards Nkaleng, was it not made more possible for them, to use different language, by the configuration of the wire? I mean, I suppose the answer to that, in retrospect, with hindsight, must be yes, but other things flow from that, which presumably may be explored.
Chair, with respect, these are the difficulties we have. As a matter of fact, Chair, we know 3,000 people who moved westwards. So why were they not invited to Nkaleng by the barbed wire? All of these things are legitimate questions we must still engage Mr. White about.
What I'm seeking to do is to get this witness's comment on what Mr. White says. In due course, Mr. White will come. You will question him about it. But in the meanwhile, as much as we have the person responsible for the plan giving evidence, it seems appropriate to put what Mr. White says so that he can deal with it. No further.
Chair, if I can just clarify before Colonel Scott answers, Mr. White isn't saying anything about the intention of the strikers. He's not saying, are they going home, they're coming to attack. He says nothing about intention. He's merely commenting on the change in the plan and the way the razor wire is deployed, and he says, in his opinion, it channels them towards Nkaleng, and that's what you're being asked to comment on.
I think if...
I think it should be made clear that if this is in fact correct, that there's no suggestion that there was any conscious, am I correct? No suggestion there was any conscious intention on the part of the police to get the people to move, or the militant group or whatever, to move towards Nkaneng. You're only dealing, as it were, with hindsight, the benefit of hindsight, with the objective consequences of what was done. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair. Where all this is going is on the next page of Mr. White's statement, where he says, it does not appear that the consequences of the movement of Inyala 6 were properly considered by the overall commander or by Colonel Scott. So it's all relating to
I understand that.
the effect on the plan.
I understand, but surely, when you talk about a consequence and whether consequences were effectively considered, the first question is whether the consequence was foreseen at all. Or, well, the first question really is was it objectively viewed a result, i.e. a consequence? If the answer to that is yes, the next question is, was it foreseen? If it wasn't foreseen, then, and it's merely a consequence which is objectively seen with the benefit of hindsight, that's one thing. But of course, if there's a suggestion it was considered in some way, that's a different matter. So the question at the moment, I'm afraid, there's a penumbra of uncertainty about it. I think it'd be helpful to us all if that uncertainty could be removed and the question could be put clearly to the witness so he and the rest of us can understand what precisely is being put.
Colonel Scott, let me try again. What I'd like your comment on is Mr. White's conclusion that because POP, TRT, NIU and STF were not yet deployed to the north and the razor wires deployed in the L shape, that this in fact would channel protesters to the particular point where scene 1 occurred. That's what I'm asking for your comment on. He says nothing about the intention of the strikers or whether this was considered, because it appears not to have been considered, but just that it had that effect.
The best way
We insert the words objectively viewed with hindsight into the question.
Yes. And objectively viewed with hindsight, and my reply, objectively viewed with hindsight, my reply. But is that, again, if the strikers had seen the opportunity to move directly north and to continue moving north, which we knew they could have, that I can accept, even if the razor wires were being pulled out, because at the stage where Nyala 4 did close in on the kraal, we can see from the recently presented footage that they still make a determined effort at that stage to come around the kraal in a militant fashion and confront the police, where the first reaction from the police is to try and rush the armoured vehicles out to form a stop line. That not proceeding, they start, or succeeding, they start with the sub-lethal force, as it's mentioned in the overseas terms. But they still push through this. Now, that's the difficulty I have. Sure, with Nyala 6 being pulled back, it opened a direct route to the north. But any person not seeking confrontation or wanting to in any way get involved with the police action would have moved away from that directly north and not tried to come into the police action even after Nyala 4 is closed off. So, and I don't want to go to the point of trying to prove intention, but I can agree that they could have moved directly north, but to still have pushed the point to try to come through where the police were visibly closing off. It's difficult for me to say that there wasn't intent then on the miners' part or on the strikers' part to confront the police.
Colonel Scott and Chair, I know that we inserted the words objectively and considered with hindsight, but Mr. White's point is precisely the opposite, that it should have been seen with foresight, that it should have been taken into account in the plan, that this change to deploy the razor wire in an L shape, where you'd asked people to disperse and leave, that there would be a sizable contingent that would then be channeled towards Nkaneng. Does that change your answer at all?
Well, if you're saying when you've asked them to leave, they hadn't been asked to leave, which was part of the problem. And the other part of the problem was being that they had chosen to leave, still grouped well together within that militant group with the attitude and actions displayed. So, again, to expect the police then not to try to form some form of a barrier, and what they're seeing on ground level becomes difficult to explain, at least from somebody that wasn't there. So again, it's just not human nature, unless you're seeking confrontation with the police, to move towards the police when you can see the police are visibly preparing to carry out a tactical option on you.
Colonel Scott, it was not part of your plan that the razor wire be deployed in that L shape.
It wasn't part of the initial plan,
Yes.
no, ma'am. It was as a result that I had to work around that now.
Yeah, and Commissioner Henraj, to build on that point, Colonel Scott, I think a lot of this back and forth is coming because we seem to be talking about two different points. Mr. White's point is that it should have been anticipated in the plan that the way the razor wire was being deployed would channel people towards Nkaneng. Your testimony seems to concentrate on how it was actually done on the day and the execution on the day, which is a different point. Mr. White has other things to say about that. But and I'll ask it one more time and then I'll move on. With respect to Mr. White's point that in your plan, once Nyala 6 is pulled back, the razor wire is being deployed in an L shape, and before the other members are deployed to the north, that deployment of razor wire invites the protesters around the kraal to where they confronted the police.
I can understand in what he does say that sometimes police action precipitates an action in response from the crowd, and if it was a bona fide action to simply disperse on their own, I could understand that they would want to disperse and disperse away, and that means even walking north parallel to the wire. That's understandable, but I can't concede or even admit to why they would want to come to the point. I don't think it's channelizing them to that point of the kraal, no. I think that's a decision taken by them to move that way, irrespective of what the police are trying to do.
Colonel Scott, I'm moving on to Mr. White's next criticism of the plan, which is, and let me just state for the record, this commences in Mr. White's statement at page 85, paragraph 6.5.21. This is where Mr. White deals with the fact that, in his view, your plan carried a high risk of the need to use live ammunition. And if we can start in your second statement, which was G 39. And in particular, at page 4 of that statement, paragraph 8. This states, during the offensive tactical option of dispersing, isolating smaller groups or individuals, disarming and then arresting, a strategy to deploy a defensive line to protect the lives of the POP members and to confront belligerent armed protesters who needed to be disarmed and who refused to respond to the public order policing measures was to deploy the TRT, NIU and STF to approach the armed protesters who could, if necessary, protect themselves and the POP members with sharp ammunition against life-threatening attacks. So, Colonel Scott, what I want to put to you is that there was, in fact, an element of your plan which anticipated the need to use sharp ammunition.
That is so, and I admit to that, not anticipated, but as a contingency, looking at the threat against the police, I had to put something in place to prevent policemen being killed unnecessarily by unlawful actions and attacks on the police, because the police action was not unlawful. But any attack coming towards the policemen trying to carry out their duty was going to be unlawful. And surely the right to life is applicable to all, and specifically to those policemen who are standing with less than lethal force capability, and then the proportionate side of this is absolutely unproportionate toward them. where they would have shotguns with rubber at maximum trying to defend themselves against people with pangas, spears and possibly live ammunition firearms. So something had to be put in as a measure to help protect that pop line. And in the way I saw it as well, after Monday's incident, if you wanted the pops to carry out their duty effectively and keep the mind focused on the non-lethal side, you needed to give them the assurance that somebody was there to protect them in case they got isolated, in case something happened which put them in harm's way. So it was never the intention to go out in any way to use live ammunition to shoot any protester. But as I say, as it's part of your policing duty, you need to save life. And sometimes in order to save life, you need to take a life or wound somebody for that matter.
Colonel Scott, I understand in that paragraph where you say TRT, NIU and STF would use sharp ammunition against attacks on POP members. But you also say that you would deploy the defensive line to confront belligerent armed protesters who needed to be disarmed and who refused to respond to the public order policing measures. And you contemplated that being done by the TRT, NIU and STF who only had sharp ammunition, correct?
That is correct, but understanding as well that with water cannons, and maybe it's not put in context there properly, but that militant group with water cannons and the rest of the less than lethal force being applied to them would have found it very, very difficult to have remained in a static position and grouped together as they were. So, and as I said, my perception was going to be that they, worst case, would have approached the POPs. Next scenario was that they would have taken up hiding on higher ground where POPs members could not get to them, and that would have in any way broken that group up because they would not have been able to keep their formations. They would have in essence gone into smaller groups if not individuals, and the sweep through of those tactical units was thus to go forward and then to challenge those who were then standing as individuals or hiding or in small pockets with their own force continuum to disarm and arrest them to be carried out. That was the envisioned plan of it.
But those particular tactical units, TRT, NIU, STF, they didn't have anything but sharp ammunition, correct?
You would have found some taser weapons within the STF, but again, I think you're jumping to the far side of the force continuum. Again, those officers, if they didn't need to close the gap onto that specific person or persons, they wouldn't have done that. There are other measures which we didn't want to get into the Commission in speaking about because it can just make our opponents in the future wiser to the tactics we'd use. But that is at the far extreme. There were other measures available which I know of that could have been implemented as such to actually disarm with less than lethal force those very protesters that were presenting that threat. But what you can't do is dictate the action of the striker, and if he decided in close quarter at a 10-meter distance or so that he was now going to attack the police, they had no other option then obviously to defend themselves. But the idea was not that the police was going to go up to him with his panga and eventually shoot him out of measure because you don't want to put it down. There were other measures in place to deal with that.
Colonel Scott, on the crisp point that you anticipated that confrontation, you anticipated the possibility that your tactical units would have to engage with sharp ammunition. I'm correct in that regard?
Like I say, in self-defense, I anticipated that scenarios could arise where the police came under illegal attack from protesters or from strikers where they would need to defend themselves, yes.
And then in your consolidated statement, if we go to page 84, paragraph 13.9, there you say, I did, however, not expect that the smaller militant group would submit to the request to disperse, but considered three options when planning that they may choose to follow, which I covered in the briefing. The first of those that you say you covered was where they closed the ground on the POP line to confront them with their sharp-edged weapons. So, as I understand your evidence from the statement and your testimony today, you foresaw the risk of an attack on the police, and your plan for how to respond to such an attack was to have your tactical units respond with everything up to and including sharp ammunition.
The response initially for the POPs who would be obviously positioned in front of any tactical line, was to go straight back to their armoured vehicles. But I'm also wise to the fact that it's possible that, as I've mentioned, doors can be closed while members are still outside. It is possible that POPs members can be isolated. And again, not forgetting that the police are not carrying out an illegal action. Any attack upon the police is the illegal action. And thus the proportionality to that is to save the life of that POPs member by going forward, and if necessary, if they are hacking him with pangas, as what happened on Monday, is then to defend his life. And if it means that you need to fire sharp ammunition to defend his life, then that becomes a legal action on behalf of the police, self-defense or private defense in that matter.
Colonel Scott, given that you had made that an aspect of your plan made provision for the use of sharp ammunition to respond to an attack, do you think that this was the right plan?
Well, considering that a dispersion had to take place, because we said a tactical option had to take place, taking the POPs members, as I've stated, who are not able to defend themselves against what they were going to face due to the lack of the ability to defend themselves proportionately to in essence take the life of a striker should their life be in danger, unless going for a pistol, which we know is not always the case. Something needs to be put in place, and as I've stated before, the essence of how I planned it, I would still plan it today, because the police never went forward with malicious intent at all. And any policeman who's been through the police college, as these have, are all trained to understand what private defense and self-defense are. And there's very little circumstances outside of that one may even use your firearm, other than Section 49.2, which has got a lot of criteria stuck to it as well. So these members are quite aware and are only going to utilize those firearms at times when their lives, they feel, are endangered. If they move outside of those boundaries, that is something that they would then need to attest to and explain. But as far as the planning is concerned, as I say, it would be naive of me to say that I didn't anticipate any attack on the police. I did. I tried to put contingencies in place first in order to not have to use live ammunition. But if there was an imminent attack on a police official and there was no other way other than using live ammunition, then that is what needed to have occurred.
And am I correct that you thought this risk of the need to use sharp ammunition on your testimony to protect your members was so significant that you needed almost 200 officers that were armed with rifles?
Well, the amount of officers were there wasn't necessarily my doing or saying the amount, and that's why I'd simply chosen the smaller Kopi 2 for the lesser trained TRT to deal with, anticipating that Kopi 1 was larger and would be more difficult to have to clear or to sweep over and clear. So the amount of members, in essence, I'm not sure is if one can even work that into proportionality for that matter, because it still comes down to whether there were 10 or 50, the same task at hand needed to be dealt with.
Colonel Scott, returning to your background, and in your first statement, Triple G 39, just for the record, we don't need to go there, page 3, paragraph 6, you said that the plan or strategy I prepared or proposed was the first of its kind. And then in paragraph 6 of your second statement, you said that you weren't aware of this plan that disperses into small groups, encircle and disarm, ever being used by the SAPs. But on that, have you ever deployed a tactic in your experience where the POP would go forward to confront an armed, aggressive crowd and TRT and NIU follow with live ammunition as a backup to the POPs? Have you ever done that aspect of the plan?
I've not done that in person, but I'm aware of operations where public violence is at a large level, where the NIU get called in to assist the public order policing in townships and so on. Exactly how they go about it, I'm not sure, but I would imagine it would be something similar, that the National Intervention Unit members would only be employed, again, where life was threatened, in xenophobia type attacks, etc. But I can't speak to those. I haven't been involved in planning in any of those.
And Colonel Scott, following up, are you aware of any circumstance where the SAPs have used this plan to disperse into small groups, encircle and disarm?
I'm not personally, but then again, as we've shown, my public order policing experience is limited, so whether it's been done before, I'm not sure.
What that means is you didn't base the plan on anything that you knew had happened successfully in the past.
That's correct, Chairperson.
So as far as you were concerned, it was an original idea.
It's yes, not using original in a pride way, as some would say, but
Colonel Scott, I'd like to turn now to the last of Mr. White's three criticisms that we're highlighting around the planning. And this relates to the lack of contingency planning. We've touched on it a little bit earlier today. But you've stated, and I'm correct, I think, that you adopted a fluid approach to the planning between 14 to 16 August because the situation was changing, correct?
well, we couldn't anticipate how it would change. So yes, we didn't know what would be happening from day to day or hour to hour.
Right. And then we don't need to go there, but for the record, Mr. White in his final statement, page 66, paragraph 6.4.3, says, as a basic principle, if one chooses to adopt a fluid approach to planning, it's important to pay particular attention to risk analysis and contingency planning. Do you agree with him?
Yes, I do.
In respect of risk analysis, the only risk analysis that we can find in your contemporaneous plans is contained in Exhibit J 50, Slide 7. If we could display Slide 7 of Exhibit J 50. This is a slide headed Risk Assessment. It consists of 2 bullet points. The first, AMCU possibly defined feeling the clash with SAPs resulted in their victory with killing of police officials and seizing police radios and weapons. The second point, witch doctor providing muti to AMCU group, creating mindset of invincibility. So, Colonel Scott, as a matter of fact, these are the only 2 dimensions to a risk analysis that we can find in your contemporaneous planning. Is that correct?
That's what you can find. That was set up on the Monday evening, early hours of Tuesday morning, as I've mentioned, and that presentation ran into the Tuesday and is all that we knew at that stage. So as the operation drew on and the JOCOM started sitting, so I didn't deal anymore with intelligence, and for that matter, when the intelligence is delivered, you would initially look at the risks inherent with that intelligence given. So I'd been moved straight on to just dealing with the strategy, or briefing the strategy to the commanders in the JOCOM. But when it does come down to contingency planning, as I state, we can take each phase, and I can explain the phase with the contingencies that were built into it, both on behalf of the strikers as well as on behalf of the police. But and I've mentioned it, that being a presentation, it's not all that was done or said. There was speaking to this, which obviously is far more comprehensive than what you would see in the presentation, dealing with, amongst others, the rationales, the mindsets, the contingencies that go with the positionings of different forces in different areas.
Right. Colonel Scott, I understand that broader context and where it fits into your planning process, but just to go back...
Can we perhaps take the tea adjournment at this stage, unless you want to make this ask the question first? I'm in your hands.
No, that's fine, Chair.
All right, we'll take the tea adjournment at this point.